challenge. How am I doing on time, by the way? 5 minutes to go? I'd like that extra 5 minutes that the other speaker got to. No, I'm just joking. It's fine. I want to talk very briefly about asylum patterns. One of the big challenge is mixed motives. The old language of refugee, economic refugee, really doesn't work, and what we often confront is someone that's leaving for mixed motives. We know that happens. I'm going to give you a very graphic example because I think it'll crystallize it. If we have a African farmer, his crops have failed for the third year, he suffers from drought, but it's also long-term desertification, which is this issue around climate. His family is starving. There's often illness and death as well. He has no work, so that's an economic issue because the traditional route to the city has been interrupted. As well, he lives in a conflict zone. Well, it's not just a conflict zone. It's because of competition between tribes for decreasing resources. In addition, there's another political factor. He's a member of a tribal minority, and there's less reassurance of state protection. And finally, he has a brother living in France. So that's a personal decision, but that's sorry. Oh, okay. That's a departure. That's not a departure decision. That's in terms of an arrival decision. So that's a fairly typical pattern of someone who could be called an economic migrant, a forced migrant, or in some senses a refugee. The challenges are that they don't. The challenges are it's very hard to identify them. I'll make a couple of points. The first two were already made by Robert, so I don't have to repeat them. Basically, we know that the asylum routes are more complex. People are now going to secondary movement where they didn't before. And we know that the countries of origin are often now also becoming transit countries for other refugees and host countries for other refugees. So once again, the pattern is very complex. I'm going to move through my two observations because of time. I did want to talk about two key notions. Interdiction. 80% of asylum seekers are in the global south. However, the global north has devoted a great deal of time to avoiding access or preventing access to their asylum systems. You have a long list of the principal measures for doing that. I think a lot of them will be fairly familiar to you. I'm actually going to go down to number 5, extraterritorial interception, and that's simply because of time. So this is where, in various ways, you actually intercept the asylum seeker while they're definitely offshore. The U.S., the United Kingdom, Australia has practiced interception on the high seas. Canada considered it in regard to the Tamil boat claimants, and since it happens to be a technical problem, a violation of international law, they decided not to do it. But what often happens is interception further away than that. So, for example, the European Union has agreements with West African countries that they can intercept in their territorial waters and return them to their points of departure. The critical issue in that is that there is no assessment of their refugee status or identifying whether or not they're asylum seekers or not. So when a boat is intercepted and returned to a country, there's no way of knowing whether that person is at risk or perhaps a forced migrant with very serious circumstances. And that's where the world is really not paying attention. I'm going to give you the most extreme example, which is in a 2008 agreement between Italy and Libya, where the Libyan government can intercept or European Frontex organization can intercept and deliver them in the hands of the Libyans to do the refugee determination in Libya. Libya is not a signatory to the UN Convention, and their prisons do not have a Club Med atmosphere, to put it nicely. So in that situation, the result has been that often people don't know what happens to these people, if they're tortured, if they're abused, if they're still there, or if they are deported back to their own countries. And as a very graphic image to really conclude on this notion, in the last 2 weeks, approximately 300 people have exited out of the state of Libya. Most of them are temporary workers, so for them, they will be able to eventually make it back to their home countries. but there are certainly thousands, we don't know how many, of asylum seekers or forced migrants or simply economic migrants, and it's unclear what's going to happen to those people. There's a lot of asylum issues. I'm not going to touch on any of them, but again, once I do want to come down to two issues that overlap, and that's the border controls and interdiction measures, along with human smuggling and trafficking. And I've been waiting for this expression. There is a perverse symbiosis between these two factors, and essentially what happens is when you raise the borders, that creates business for smugglers and traffickers. When you smuggle and traffic, that irritates the people trying to put up the borders, so they raise the borders higher. And we can see this happening in Europe, and certainly, without going into details, we can see it in recent Canadian policy in regard to Tamil boats. The last thing to say is, in terms of protection gaps, at some point we're going to have to think about internally displaced and others. Robert has already spoken about climate change. And the last point is, if we have an international protection system that isn't working very well, one of the concerns is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees has never had the legal authority to really oversee and impose accountability on the member nations who are the signatories. So that's a very serious problem. The second issue is that the people who are often in breach of the convention are the principal donors to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So that creates a problem. And the third one is UNHCR more and more is losing the focus of their mandate. They're often engaged in emergency humanitarian measures, blankets for Pakistan. It is not that that is not important, but the world, in terms of the international protection of refugees, is losing the supervisory focus of how we're managing a system that is slowly coming apart. Thank you.